Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and I'm so excited to have with me today my recently kind of new friend, Matthew Adelstein, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing and have been
Yeah,
pronouncing
you got it.
correctly. Excellent, excellent. I'm so glad that you're here today. Matthew is, I'll tell you what I know first is that you were once not a theist, and now you are a theist, not an atheist. You are a theist, and the reason for that is because of evidence, and I'm assuming it has a lot to do with the argument or an argument from fine tuning. And so we're going to be talking about that today. That's an exciting topic because many atheists will say that that is the argument for God's existence. One from that family is probably the best that theists have to offer. It's not my favorite argument, but it's one that I like and I'm very interested in. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. But Matthew debated Matt Dillahunty recently, and so we now have that in common. And I have to say, I'm not sure I've ever seen someone do as well against Matt as Matthew did, the way that he did it. And I should go ahead and say that when I say Matt, if I don't say otherwise, I'm probably referring to Dillahunty. If I say Matthew, I'm probably referring to Adelstein. So Matthew Adelstein, welcome to the show and tell us whatever you'd like about yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Matthew. I'm a student in philosophy at the University of Michigan. I'm in my third year, and I have a blog called Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's Newsletter where I talk about philosophy. You can find it by Googling.
Are you a utilitarian?
Yeah, though a lot of utilitarians are hedonistic utilitarians, so they think that the only thing that matters is like the total sum of happiness, of like pleasure. I don't think that's right. I'm what's known as an objectivist utilitarian, where I think that what one ought to do is maximize how well off things go for people in the aggregate. But I think that there isn't just one thing that makes a person's life go well. It's not just pleasure. It's pleasure, relationships, knowledge, achievements. So
if someone wonders why I just dog-legged us off into that topic all of a sudden, it was because of Bentham's Bulldog made me think of that.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
All right, so go on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh yeah, no worries. That's basically who I am. I'm a philosophy student who sometimes talks and blogs about philosophy and various other subjects.
Yeah, and you're one of those guys that I recently read a Substack article you had on insect suffering. And so these kind of things are really interesting. Now, I should say that you have these really cerebral articles, and I love it. And you can argue for the existence of God at a higher level than some people out there. But at the same time, I should mention you're not, I'll say yet, hopefully not condescendingly, a Christian. And so I'm excited to have you here, and I'm excited to show people that it's not just Christians that do this kind of work with atheists online and debating them and that sort of thing. But I do have to say, Matthew, it's my hope that by the end of this stream, maybe you'll be a Christian. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Jim Amberg, for the $20 super chat. So what I've done, folks, is there was a debate on Matt Dillahunty's own website or on his own YouTube channel. I think this is the first time he's hosted a debate there, maybe not. But Matthew was that guest. And from what it sounded like, Matthew, you've called in to the line a couple of times, his call-in show that he does now. And so they selected you. They thought you were a good candidate for this. And it was a debate on whether we should believe in God. Matthew brought an incredible hypothetical that I think exposed an inconsistency in the way Dillahunty thinks about the fine-tuning argument. And so I've put together some clips from the debate, mostly of Matt, just to set up Matthew to talk about what Matt said or brought as an objection. And it really just, what I love about this, Matthew, is it just turned into just a point by point, a list of common objections to fine-tuning arguments that you were then able to parody with your own hypothetical. So before we go on, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the made by God hypothetical that you created and used throughout this debate.
Sure. So one way you can identify that an argument is wrong is you can show that it proves too much. So if it were right, it would imply certain things that are ridiculous. So here's one thing that I think really clearly would count as evidence for God. Suppose that scientists discovered that the initial conditions of the universe, the state that the universe was in at the Big Bang, spelled out made by God with love in every human language. So English, for just all the languages. that would clearly be very strong evidence for the existence of God. But if you think about a lot of the replies to fine-tuning, would imply that in a case like that, that wouldn't be evidence for the existence of God. So for instance, one common reply to fine-tuning is people say that they're not sold on fine-tuning because fine-tuning assumes the constants could be different. But who knows if the constants could be different? Well, one could similarly say, well, hold on, if the initial condition spelled out made by God, that assumes that's not evidence because there's no reason to think they could be anything else. But we would all recognize that's a silly response because even if in some like metaphysical sense, like even if you think whatever the state is that they were in is necessary, it's super unlikely they'd happen to be in that very particular necessary state. There are other things that people say about fine-tuning. So one thing people will say is they'll suggest that the fine-tuning, it can't be evidence for God because we didn't predict it in advance, or it doesn't like demonstrate that God exists in the sense that we haven't observed God with our eyes or something. But okay, but if it's spelled out made by God, even if we hadn't seen God with our eyes, it would still be reasonable to think that there's probably God based on the effects that it has. Other things people say is they say, well, there's only a sample size of 1 for the universe. So how can you do probabilities on a sample size of 1? But if the universe spelled out made by God, there would also only be a sample size of 1. Nonetheless, we would recognize that would be ridiculously improbable and that it would be evidence for the existence of God. So I think this can help us see what's wrong with a lot of the standard replies to fine-tuning.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is you thought, okay, if we say, and this is what you put to Matt, and we're going to hear his response just in a moment. But what you put to Matt is you said, Matt, if we observed that early after the universe began, it was written out in all these languages made by God with love or something like that. Wouldn't that be evidence? And a lot of this has to do with how one understands the nature of evidence, what evidence is, what qualifies as evidence, and that sort of thing. But if we knew that to be true, wouldn't that count? And if the answer is yes, that would count as good evidence for at least something that we could call an intender or a designer of some sort for this. Then isn't that true of fine-tuning? Doesn't that move over to fine-tuning because it's ridiculously unlikely that you would get made by God in every language from the earliest moments of the universe. It's also ridiculously unlikely that you would get a universe that allows for life. And so for these reasons, if you accept that made by God in all languages would be good evidence for an intender or a designer or God, then you should think the same thing about the fine-tuning. Now, is that a fair characterization of what you're saying?
Yeah. And sorry, one thing I should mention. So, I mean, I think a lot of the objections that Dillahunty gives to fine-tuning are not the most serious objections. But I think even this works to show what's wrong with some of the more serious ones. So like one of the more serious objections to fine-tuning, people say, well, it looks like there's fine-tuning now, but maybe it will be explained by deeper physics. And the point there is that, sure, maybe deeper physics would explain it, but it's unlikely that deeper physics would set the constants to be in this very small range. Just like if you saw that the initial condition spelled out made by God, you could always say, well, maybe it spells it out that way as a result of deeper physics. But it would still be improbable because it's unlikely that deeper physics would be such as it would spell that particular sequence of shapes out rather than forming some other shape. So yeah, I think it can illustrate what's wrong with a lot of the popular replies to fine-tuning.
Yeah, and a lot of these responses, and then I'm going to play the video right after I say this, but a lot of the responses that Dillahunty uses are the ones that you hear on YouTube and all over the internet, where people seem to kind of feel like if we just throw out this answer, it at least makes the whole issue sufficiently ambiguous that we can't conclude anything really about it, especially not that there's a God. And I think you're going to see why that fails. So I'm going to go ahead and play the first of these, and let's just I put them all into one video file, so we'll just go through them. But let's see, it's up there now. Okay, so you've just asked, at the point we're starting the video, you've just presented him with that hypothetical and asked him, would that count as evidence for God? Here's his answer.
I have no idea. In that particular hypothetical scenario, which by the way is not remotely what we have, I think it could be completely understandable why people would reasonably conclude that that was a message from a God. I don't understand the in every possible language. I mean, it seems like
Sorry, I said
the
in every
scenario.
human language.
Okay, I don't know how it's possible to say. So individually, there's like a billion statements there covering every language and dialect, and they all say created with love from God.
Yeah,
Then at a
you
minimum,
can imagine it's in really small writing.
sure. At a minimum, that would make it seem that it's rational to conclude that there is a being capable of doing that, and that may be sufficiently close to godlike for us to not care whether it's the Omnimax God or not. But in any case, it would be really, really incredible evidence that it's more likely that there's a being capable of doing that. Whether or not it's a God is a separate thing. You could.
Okay, so what are your comments on this, Matthew? Sorry, I thought instead of playing Matthew's response from the video and then just having him say the same thing, we've got him right here on the line. So, what do you think of what he just said?
Yeah. So it seems to grant that it would be evidence for a designer of some sort. Now, I'll agree
Isn't that all
that
you want, really, at this point with him? Is we don't need you to necessarily think this demonstrates an Omnimax God. We just need you to admit at this point that it seems designed or intended. Is that fair?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I do think the fine-tuning will establish that there's an Omnimax God rather than just a limited God. Because I think if you have a limited God, then you have to sort of precisely set the powers, knowledge, and desires of the God so that they bring about a finely tuned universe. Well, if you have an unlimited God, it's just totally unlimited, so you don't have any properties that need to be finely tuned. This is a point that Robin Collins has pushed in more detail. But right, so Matt seems to grant that in this case, we'd have evidence at least of a designer. And then the question is, okay, so why doesn't he grant that about fine-tuning? And, well, I mean, as we'll hear, it's not at all clear why he doesn't grant that why he thinks that this is relevantly different from fine-tuning. I mean, he gives some replies that that don't work. I point out why they don't work, and then he flits to a new reply. But I so
appreciate that he did that for us, because what it meant was in trying to, you've responded to one thing and he's like, okay, well, I'm going to change posture and go with this one. And okay, I'm going to change posture and go with this one. And I'm not even saying that he necessarily was thinking in his head, I'm moving to a different known response. I think he's just kind of talking with you about it, but it allows for us to see how clearly this parody that you gave handles all those things.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't handle some of the things he gave, but the things it didn't handle are just wrong for other reasons.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump into it then and see what he says next here.
Could change some of the constants, you could change things and have a different universe crop up where a different set of life forms would be considering how the universe was created for them.
So, Matt, what are some of the examples of fine-tuning that are cited by theists that if the constants were to be changed, do you think you could get a different kind of life? Like, for example, do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass?
I have no idea. I'm not even convinced that those things could. I'm sorry, what?
Well, sorry. So what you just said was that, look, if you change the constants, you could get life arising under different conditions, and then there's different kinds of life. Yeah, and then you said there's different kinds of life. Then they would be wondering to themselves, "Oh, it's so surprising we got them." So I'm asking, which constants do you think you could change where you'd get different kinds of life? Do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass? Which one is this true of?
I don't know that it's true of any of them. I was presenting a hypothetical.
Okay, so here's the second moment that I wanted us to see here and that you mentioned, where he says what I've heard a lot of times. He's like, hey, if the universe had been different, if those initial conditions had been different, so it was a different universe, maybe we don't know, maybe we just get a different kind of life because life may come to exist within the parameters of that new existence. And what you did here was so great because you just started in on saying, okay, well, let's talk about that. Which one can you change and still get life? So looking back on this, first of all, that great job, but what is your follow-up to this?
Yeah, I mean, so I understand this reply from atheists. Like, it sort of makes sense logically if you don't know about the details of fine-tuning. But once you and this is one of the reasons why I think it's actually really important to actually carefully listen to people on the other side, because there are lots of responses that sound right until you learn what the informed people on the other side say. So the reason that this is wrong is basically that if you look at the constants that are claimed to be finely tuned, it's really, really improbable it's not at all plausible in any of these cases that you could get life under different conditions, right? So one of the most famous examples, right? So the best example of fine-tuning that we have is fine-tuning of the cosmological constant. That governs how rapidly the universe expands. So it like pushes stuff apart. Now, it turns out the cosmological constant is balanced on a razor's edge so that if it were a bit stronger, right after the Big Bang, after less than a millisecond, everything would have flown apart. No particles would have ever interacted. While if it were a bit weaker, the universe would have immediately recollapsed after much less than a millisecond after the Big Bang. And so the question is, so like, okay, if everything either immediately flew apart or immediately collapsed, could you get life? No, I don't think you could.
I have no idea.
Yeah. No, I mean, Matt was like, yeah, I don't know. No, and this is right. And now the other examples are sort of less obvious than fine tuning. So like, with some of them, you could have like particles moving around, but you just have no complex chemistry. So you would only have hydrogen. Now, some people think, oh, maybe you could get life. Okay, if you think you could get life from floating balls of hydrogen, then you should really be petitioning scientists to search for more extraterrestrials in floating clouds of hydrogen. Like, there are lots of floating clouds of hydrogen. Strangely, except when they're responding to fine-tuning, no one thinks it's very likely that we would find life there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just not at all plausible that if the cosmological constant didn't fall in this narrow range, that you could get any life of any kind. And so, yeah, and I mean, when I pointed this out, basically Dillahunty just sort of jumped to a different point without acknowledging that he'd been wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you say something, to put it in like everyday terms, when you say that if things had been different much at all, the universe would have either collapsed in on itself or just exploded and whatever, often things would have blown apart. Well, when the average person hears things would have been blown apart like that, the natural thing to think is, well, isn't that I mean, they expanded, not blown apart, but doesn't that kind of describe what happened? But understand that what Adelstein is saying here is we're talking about particles not even interacting, except for this possibility of a hydrogen cloud, like you said. But right, we're talking about structures not even being able to form.
Right. I mean, this would be a repulsive force, right? So there would be a repulsive force where everything flies apart and sort of keeps going, where rather than like gravity having a net effect where like things sort of tend to draw together, things would have a net effect of going apart, right? So just no stable complex structures of any kind would ever form. And in such a world, somehow I don't think it's very likely that you'd get any life. The other thing, and this is just a sort of a point about probability. So suppose that you think that so let's say it turned out that this was right. So even let's just imagine that this was correct, that you could get life with different constants. I think the fine-tuning argument would still have a lot of force. If you think, well, this is the only way you get carbon-based life, but you could get other kinds of life in other ways. Well, then you can just make the fine-tuning argument about carbon-based life. If the odds of getting carbon-based life on atheism are about 1 in Google, the odds of getting carbon-based life, the odds of God having some specific value that comes from carbon-based life, are much higher than 1 in Google. Okay, probabilities are almost never 1 in Google. For that reason, like, then you should think probably there's fine tuning just for carbon-based life. So the claim, it's factually wrong, and then even if it were correct, I think it would just be mistaken as a matter of probability, because there would still be fine tuning for specifically carbon-based life, which everyone agrees you can get. I think even the critics would admit that you couldn't get carbon-based life if, say, the Higgs mass were different, so you had no complex chemistry.
Yeah. So would you say that this has some relevance to the common puddle objection that is thrown out there popularly? The idea that, hey, the water you could have any shape of hole in the ground or pothole, and water will find the edges and fill into the edges. And imagine the puddle then going, look, we are designed to fit perfectly within this pothole. Isn't it amazing that everywhere the pothole has a crack that juts out, I fit neatly into it? But it seems to me the problem with that is any old pothole can hold water, but not any old universe can have life, right? Is that what do you think about? Is the puddle objection something that comes up here?
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. Like with the puddle analogy, the difference is that most values of the constants would not give rise to any life. Most possible shapes, or at least a sizable portion of them, could have water. Now, if we change the puddle analogy to have the shape have to fall in a very, very narrow range, so imagine there's a kind of like gas that can only exist in a very, very highly specific and particular shape, where it like has sort of protrude, like this very, very complicated shape. Well, then if you were a sentient thing of gas and you found yourself in a container of that shape, and you knew you couldn't exist in any other shape, well, then you should think that the container was made for you, because it's so unlikely. Now, I find the puddle analogy annoying because it tends to not be exactly clear. Like, it's an analogy, not an objection, and there are multiple ways one can push it. So one thing people say about the puddle analogy is they say, oh, what it gets wrong is assumes that the universe was made for us rather than that we were made for the universe by evolution. And of course, I accept evolution, but if the constants had been different, there wouldn't have been any evolution. There wouldn't have been any life. There wouldn't have been any planets. Things would have just flown apart. In a world where no particles ever interact, you will not get. You will certainly not get any life evolving on planets.
Yeah, so we've got someone here, Zach W. says, hey guys, I'm a Christian, but I've always wondered if it's even possible for the finely tuned elements of the universe to be different than they are. Is that possible? So that's actually a great segue, because we've heard now the response to whether we could get different kinds of life if the constants were different. Now let's hear what Dillahunty has to say about the possibility that, well, maybe it has to be the way it is. Maybe it couldn't have been otherwise. So here we go.
Already acknowledged that I'm not convinced those constants could have been any other way. But even, let's imagine that there's a multiversal universe generator and it keeps popping out universes. Even if all the constants lead to disaster immediately and no life other than the one we're in, that does not tell you that it was created intentionally. You are literally still, even if it was accidental, living in the only universe that could produce you.
Okay, so in the made by God case, imagine a person said the following. They said, look, it's not at all surprising that the constants spell out made by God in every human language. I'm not even convinced that they could spell out anything else. Would you say that that's a convincing reply in a world like that?
No.
Right.
Okay, so here we are now with this. Well, maybe that's the only way it could be. It just kind of had to be that way, kind of like Zach was wondering about. And your response there is beautiful. Shows the strength of the parody again to say, look, if it only ever could be that made by God with love in every language was there from the earliest moments of the universe, would we say, well, it just had to be that way, so I guess it's not impressive? Of course not. Of course, that would still be incredible evidence, right? Am I getting that there?
Right. The idea is it merely declaring a thing to be necessary doesn't lower the improbability unless there's some special reason to think it would necessarily be that way rather than some other way, right? So because for all we know, it's not like there's some reason to think that the cosmological constant would be especially likely to necessarily be the particular value that it's in. For all we know, it could be any value. And so the probability that it would happen to necessarily be that particular value rather than one of the other values is very low, just like the prior probability that the initial conditions would spell out made by God are very low. Well, you could just say that it's necessary. Merely declaring something to be necessary doesn't do anything to get rid of the improbability. Now, or another example, right? So determinists think that everything that happens is physically necessary. But imagine you go to Vegas with someone and they get 10 royal flushes in a row and you accuse them of cheating. They say, hold on. I'm a determinist. I think it's necessary that I got 10 royal flushes in a row. I don't think you would be very satisfied with that answer, because while it's true that on determinism, whatever they get would be necessary, it's so unlikely that that particular thing would happen to be necessary out of the vast panoply of conceivable things that might have been necessary.
Yeah, it's like the response would be for me if I was a determinist in such a scenario. I think you were determined to cheat today. I think that's what happened. So, all right. So, anything else to say on that objection or response?
No.
All right.
I mean, I'll just note that if you bought this objection, then you would think that if determinism is true, nothing would ever be evidence for anything. because on determinism, whatever explanation you go with is evidence. Okay, but determinists should obviously accept that sometimes you get evidence for things. So
Yeah, interesting. I'm kind of rolling it around in my head still, but let's go on to the next.
So you're saying that it's very improbable that the things that would be the initial conditions would happen to correspond to any written human language. But and I would say, yeah, but I also think it's really improbable that the cosmological constant, out of all of the values that one could imagine it taking on, would take on a value that happens to be one of the minuscule portions of possible cosmological constant values that give rise to the formation of complex structures. Now, you say
that is the only way any of us have this conversation.
Okay, well, so that's a different reply. So now you're raising the kind of anthropic bias reply. Okay, so I'll address that, but I just flag, that's a different reply from saying that the constants couldn't have been different.
Yeah, so I really just wanted to put that in there because now he moves to the anthropic principle. And so I thought I would give you a chance to talk a little bit more about that. This is one of my favorites. And you brought up the sharpshooter analogy that comes up. So go ahead and tell us why the idea that, okay, fine, but the only reason we're here having this discussion is because things happen to be right. So we feel special. What do you have to say about this?
So that's true, but that's not relevant probabilistically. People act like, the fact that if X hadn't happened, then you wouldn't have been around to observe that X hadn't happened, doesn't tell you anything about whether X happening is evidence for some other hypothesis. So a famous example from John and Leslie, imagine there's a massive firing squad of 100 people and they all point their guns at me and fire, okay? And all their guns jam, and so I get away. And after this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, maybe there was a conspiracy of some sort. Maybe maybe they all were, they all just read my blog and sort of just didn't want to shoot me. Many possibilities, but probably something funny happened. And then I think, well, no, I have no evidence for that, because if their guns hadn't jammed, I wouldn't be around to reflect on that fact. That's totally irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you wouldn't have been around to think about fine-tuning if there hadn't been fine-tuning. Fine-tuning can still be evidence for God. Or as another example, the fact that you exist is good evidence that your parents did not use effective contraception. Okay, and that's true even though if they had used effective contraception, you probably wouldn't exist. Even though, if you hadn't existed, you wouldn't have been around to observe that fact. The fact that you exist can still be evidence. And this is why, by the way, of the philosophers who think seriously about fine-tuning, there's essentially no one I know of who buys this anthropic objection. It's very widely rejected because there's widespread agreement that the probabilistic basis for it is just totally wrong.
Yeah, so just to make it more clear to people again, imagine the firing squad. You have all of these sharpshooters who really aren't going to miss. It's really unlikely that any of them will miss, all things being equal. But now you've got so many of them, and it's like the bullets are lining your body, like Pulp Fiction style or something, and or like Roger Rabbit or whatever. And then you live. And then someone says, well, yeah, but it's not that impressive. I mean, don't think there was some design or intent here or anything. I mean, because if one of them had killed you, you wouldn't be here to wonder that. It's like, okay, that doesn't tell me anything about the fact that is still pretty amazing, right? So, okay, so we've talked about these things. That's all I have video clips for, but there's a lot more in the debate. But one thing that you mentioned that we could talk about, and I think this is very interesting when it comes to Dillahunty, is what he thinks counts as evidence. And Dillahunty has famously said, I don't know what it would take to convince me, but if there's a God, he should know, and he should be able to provide it for me. And so I asked him in debate, and I think you asked him similar enough questions in debate. Many other people have. Okay, well, what do you think would count as evidence? What would convince you or something? And the way he answers this puts you in a situation where he hasn't set forth ahead of time a goal for you to hit. So whatever you put out there, no matter how good it is, I'm not saying he's trying to do this deceptively or something, but no matter what you say, if he doesn't know what it would take or what would count as good evidence, then he can always just raise the bar higher and say, well, that doesn't do it either. Hence why many people online, whether you think this is charitable or fair or not, often point out with Dillahunty, I'm unconvinced is how he wins debates. So what do you think about what Matt counts as evidence, and what do you think counts as evidence?
So it wasn't quite clear how Matt was using the term evidence. One thing he said a few times is, for something to be evidence for something else, it has to uniquely point in favor of that, right? So if some fact A is equally consistent with two hypotheses B and C, then A isn't evidence for B. Now, okay, this is totally wrong, and this is not how, philosophers think about evidence. So suppose that that you had, I don't know. So suppose I get, we're in Vegas. I get 10 royal flushes in a row. And you accuse me, and Matt Dillahunty, he's with me, and he says, I think you're cheating. And I say, well, hold on. There's no evidence that I'm cheating. Me getting 10 royal flushes doesn't uniquely point in favor of the cheating hypothesis over the I got really lucky hypothesis. Therefore, there's no evidence that I'm cheating, and I'm simply not convinced that I'm cheating. No one would find that very persuasive because, well, even if it's consistent with multiple explanations, so long as one of the explanations is more likely, there's more other evidence for it, then we ought to believe that one. Similarly, even if you can come up with other explanations of fine-tuning, so long as it raises the probability of theism, then if you didn't start out almost certain that theism is false, then possibly it's enough to get you up for the 50% threshold. Now, I think my kind of assessment of Dillahunty's epistemology is it's sort of more vibes-based than like strict criteria-based, right? So he kind of has like a very deep sense that there's not evidence for God. And he doesn't have a super clear thing in mind of exactly what he counts as evidence. But what he's really confident is whatever evidence is, God doesn't meet it. And so he sort of flits between a few different definitions. But I think when you try to get him to pin him down on what evidence is, what the conditions are that God allegedly doesn't meet, his definitions always end up being really implausible and end up ruling out that any evidence for lots of things, right? So Dillahunty, for instance, and one thing lots of atheists say is they say, well, there's we can't, God's never been produced. We've never been able to witness God directly. Okay, there are lots of things that we've never witnessed directly that we believe in. So, and in fact, the analogy I gave in the debate was dark matter. So dark matter is a kind of invisible matter that's posited by scientists that fills the universe and gives off gravity, but doesn't give off light. We cannot see dark matter. It's by definition, it's not the sort of thing we could see. But we're pretty sure that it exists because it explains a lot of facts about the world. And so because we have this not terribly outlandish explanation that explains lots and lots of different facts about the world with just one posit, we should think probably there is dark matter. Similarly, so we think, so with dark matter, we end up thinking, okay, well, lots of things about the world can be explained if we posit that there's a thing that's kind of like ordinary matter, but different in some ways, different in that it doesn't give off light. In similar fashion, well, lots about the world can be explained if we posit that it's at its foundation, there's a mind that's kind of like other minds, but different in certain respects. And so we should think that exists. And just as we have lots of evidence for dark matter in the form of stuff that is more strongly predicted if there's dark matter than if there's not, we also have lots of evidence for God in the form of stuff that's more strongly predicted if there's a God than if there's not. So, yeah, so I think Dillahunty's conception of what evidence is, I mean, he's not always so clear about exactly what he counts as evidence, but normally when he tries to lay out conditions, either theism clearly meets the conditions, or it's kind of like unclear, or there are other things that we rightly believe in that by his standard there is no evidence for. One other thing that Dillahunty likes to say is, you haven't even proved that such and such is possible, much less that it's real.
I was about to bring that up.
Yeah. Now, so with dark matter, I mean, this is the kind of thing that sounds good in a debate until you think about it for 2 seconds. We're like, when have we proved any, how does one go about proving that a thing is possible? What kind of possibility is he talking about? Okay, here, one thing I'm very confident in, I think evolution happened. Now, the reason why we're justified in believing in evolution isn't because scientists first did metaphysics to prove that it was possible, and then later gathered out. No, it's because there are lots of facts about the world, like nested hierarchies, transitional fossils, endogenous retroviruses, the sort of biomolecular evidence that are very well explained if evolution happened and very poorly explained if evolution didn't happen. It wasn't like they proved that it was possible first, or with dark matter. The reason why scientists didn't first prove that dark matter was possible. In fact, prior to us discovering that there was dark matter, there was no reason to think it was possible, at least physically possible. Instead, what they found is that there were lots of things about the world that fit very well with this not totally outlandish hypothesis. And so they thought, okay, so we should accept this not totally outlandish hypothesis. Another example is take various historical claims. Basically all historians are convinced that Hannibal crossed the Alps using elephants. They didn't first prove that that was possible. No, they got evidence for it. They found written records of it. They found feces deposits that were consistent with it. And so I just think the standard of you have to first prove the thing is possible. I don't know how one goes it's not the standard applied in the sciences. It's not the standard applied by anyone, and it's not clear why it would be required. The other thing is it's not clear what exactly what kind of possibility Dillahunty's talking about. Philosophers distinguish between different kinds of possibility. One kind is called logical possibility. That's just about not having a contradiction. One kind's about metaphysical possibility, which is something like whether it's a real state of affairs that could exist. So if you believe that there is objective morality, for example, you might think a state of affairs with no objective morality, it's not straightforwardly contradictory, but it couldn't really exist. And then there's also physical possibility, which is possibility consistent with the physical laws. Now, I don't know what kind of possibility Dillahunty is talking about. I don't know if Dillahunty knows what kind of possibility Dillahunty is talking about. But generally the default is thinking that things are possible, at least in the logical or metaphysical sense, unless there's some reason to think that they're impossible. There aren't any unicorns, but unicorns are possible. There's nothing that rules them out. So even if you had to first prove it was possible, well, we should think it's possible. There's every reason to think it's possible, in that there doesn't seem to be a contradiction or any absurdity that lies therein. So, it's just this giant morass of confusion. So anyways.
Yeah. And similarly, when we're talking about probability, like you were talking about, with possibility, there's logically possible, metaphysically possible, and so forth. With probability, he was doing some interesting things with the term likely and probable, as if once we find out the actual state of affairs, it turned out the other wasn't probable at all. And it seemed to me that what we were missing was epistemic probability, or for lack of better terminology, so far as I know, this is what the probability seems to be, right? Rather than in a deterministic universe, whatever ends up happening, well, that's the only thing that could happen, which seemed to be the perspective that we were hearing from. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about? Does that sound like something you experienced in the debate?
Yeah. So, it wasn't so clear what kind of possibility he was talking about, but he did seem to have this notion that, for some explanation to be probable, that he was saying one of the reasons why we don't have any evidence for God is that belief in God is that sort of we only have one sample, right? So we only have one instance of it. So it's the way you get evidence for things is we only say things are improbable if they don't usually turn out that way. But in the case of God and the universe, we only have one sample, so it can't be evidence. Okay, this is wrong for a bunch of reasons. First of all, the made by God case illustrates that it's wrong. In the made by God case, we would also only have one universe, but still that would be evidence that there's a creator of some sort. Second of all, if we applied this sort of naive frequentist epistemology consistently, then we'd throw out much of the evidence for many of the things that we believe in. So one thing that most people quite justifiably believe in is continental drift. They think that the continents all used to be part of one big continent, and then they drifted apart. Okay, and there's lots of evidence for this. So the evidence comes from the fact that up until some period of time, the fossils in South America and Africa were very similar, and then they diverged. So that can be explained by them splitting apart. It comes from the fact that the continental shelves of the different continents seem to fit together like a puzzle piece. It comes from all sorts of things. But we don't have like multiple trial runs of continental drift where we say it usually turns out that way. Nonetheless, we have evidence for it because out of all the ways that you would expect it to turn out, if continental drift were true, match much better with the ways it actually turns out than the ways you'd expect it to turn out if continental drift were false. Third, there's a problem with this kind of naive frequentism where you say, oh, you only declare a thing improbable if it usually doesn't turn out that way. But there's a question of exactly how you're constructing the reference classes of ways of whether it usually turns out that way, right? So imagine, so Dillahunty would say, well, we think the probability of a coin coming up heads is 1/2 because coins come up heads about half the time. Okay, but so why is the relevant reference class what percentage of times coins in general come up? Suppose that that day in particular, 6/7 of coins have come up heads in the surrounding 40 miles. Well, should we then say that probably the coin will come up heads? So I think a better way of reasoning, rather than trying to construct reference classes and figure out the portions of the reference classes that have different properties, is you just figure out some fact is evidence for a hypothesis. If it's likelier given the hypothesis, then given not that the falsity of the hypothesis, and this likelihood in terms of how much you'd expect the fact if you knew the hypothesis was true versus if it was false. So if I get 10 royal flushes in a row, that would be really, really unlikely. You really wouldn't expect that if you knew I wasn't cheating. If you knew I wasn't cheating, that would be a miracle of historic proportions. In contrast, if you knew I was cheating, you'd think, well, it's not super likely, but it's a hell of a lot more likely than if I was not cheating. So you get evidence that I'm cheating. By the way, one thing that was pretty funny in the debate was, so I said that if some fact A is likelier given B than given not B, then that means that B is likelier given A than not A. And Dillahunty just super confidently denied this. Now, this is a really trivial mathematical fact. It's the kind of thing you'll learn in kind of a basic high school stats course. It's very easy to see why it's true. It just follows from Bayes' theorem, right? So Bayes' theorem says when you look at how likely some fact is after considering some evidence, you look at how likely it is given the evidence divided by how likely it is given the falsity of the evidence to update the odds ratio. And so just if the top number is bigger than the bottom number, necessarily you get a boost in probability. And I said that this is an easy fact. It's trivial to check. You can enter it into ChatGPT. And Dillahunty, he sort of blew up and he was like, I'm not interested in entering it into ChatGPT because ChatGPT is a predictive language model that can make errors. Okay. It's just astounding that he was this confident and this wrong about it. And so, a good heuristic is don't read comments beneath debates you've had if you don't want to become just deeply enraged. But it was so irritating reading the comments where you had lots of the commenters chewing me out for citing ChatGPT. When really my point was this is a very basic, easily checkable, easily Googleable fact. And so just imagine if it had gone the other way. Imagine if I had asserted some very trivial and false statistical claim. Imagine if I had said, I don't know, imagine if I had said the probability of A and B is sometimes higher than the probability of just A. Okay, that's trivially false. And Dillahunty had denied it and told me to enter it into ChatGPT. And then I had said, I'm not interested in entering it into ChatGPT. ChatGPT is a predictive language model. Would anyone have thought that I came off well in that exchange? Of course not. Would any of the atheists be like, wow, I'm normally on Matt's side, but, Matthew really wrecked him there. No, it's just, they just go in with, assuming that Dillahunty's right about everything and then don't bother to check anything.
Yeah, I think that was just a rhetorical point. The moment that he heard you say ChatGPT, I think he thought this is a rhetorical moment to point out that that's a really lowbrow way of doing research that my opponent just recommended when anybody else knows you were just saying, no, dude, just Google that. You'll see that I'm right, is what you were trying to say. You just use ChatGPT, and ChatGPT does actually bring up citations sometimes that you can chase down and go check. So now what I really want is, Matthew, I just want to see a comedy film made for a very niche audience with you and Matt Dillahunty going to casinos in Las Vegas on a buddy trip and arguing about probability the whole time. So we'll see if we can get that to happen. So is there anything else from this debate that you want to talk about or you think needs to be highlighted here? While you're thinking about that, one thing that I want to point out is I was just criticized a couple of weeks ago because I was pointing out in my book, Core Facts, how classical Christian apologists, and again, just want to make clear to everyone, you're not a Christian, and make clear that I'm saying not yet, and hopeful that you will one day be in that flock, in that fold. But people, there was a couple of atheists who were going through my book, and they were saying, this reading the book here, you see that they tell you things that you never would have found out, that they never want to say in public. Like here, Braxton Hunter is saying that on the way he does things, like, and this is classical apologetics, one of the methods that Christian apologists will use, is we argue first that some God exists, a God consistent with Christian theism, but that some God exists, so that when we come to the case for the resurrection, we've demonstrated that a power sufficient to do something like a resurrection is possible, or it does exist, rather. I'm talking like Dillahunty now, does exist. And so these guys were saying, well, see, he's being deceptive. He's admitting here that it's not only the Christian God or necessarily the Christian God. They won't say that publicly. No, in a case like this, the reason that I can get on here with Matthew Adelstein and talk about a theistic argument, an argument for God's existence, is he and I both believe that some God exists. Then you move on to the resurrection case to, from a Christian perspective, try and demonstrate that this God is the God of Christian theism because he somehow endorsed Jesus's ministry by raising him from the dead. So I wanted to clarify why, because a lot of times people wonder, why would a Christian just want to talk about God's existence? This doesn't prove the Christian God. And I know there will be people, Matthew, as you mentioned, I know there will be people in the comments say, so what? Even if this design argument demonstrates a God, it's not necessarily the Christian God. Right. Yeah. We're doing God right now. We'll get to Christianity on a video with somebody else like Mike Lycona about the resurrection. Right. So now that I've kind of put that out there, if you want to comment on that, you can. Is there anything else you want to say about the debate?
Right. I mean, so whether or not God exists is obviously relevant to whether or not Christianity is true, because Christianity requires God exists. Right. So imagine you're trying to figure out that some guy committed a crime. Well, first you should try to demonstrate that the crime was committed by someone, and then you see, oh, but who was it who committed the crime? And so first you establish, okay, a God exists, and then you look at, okay, but is he one who raised Jesus in first century Roman Palestine? Is he one that provided revelation to Muhammad, telling him to sleep with 9-year-olds? Is he one who told Joseph Smith that he got to have a bunch of wives? Like, which one is it? And I think at some point, right. So it's obviously relevant. And this is a kind of like there's a common thing I see on that atheists reply where they say, oh, even if you think this establishes that there's a God of some sort, it doesn't establish some particular God. And they treat it as if it's this gotcha, when, like, of course, no one says that you should be a Christian just because of the fine-tuning argument. What they say is that the fine-tuning argument establishes, or at least raises, the likelihood that there's a God of some sort, and then that, in conjunction with the specific evidence for Christianity, makes it reasonable for you to be a Christian. Now, regarding the debate, I enjoyed the debate. I think it went pretty well. I think like there are lots of things that you'll see crop up a lot on atheist YouTube, or like from lots of atheists, that they sort of sound plausible at first, but when you kind of think through them, they end up just being kind of demonstrably wrong. Or some of them you don't even have. Some of them are wrong, not in ways that you can think through by yourself, but when you read things on the subject, you can see that they're just factually mistaken. Like, that's what was true of the objection that says, well, life could have arisen under different conditions. Okay, maybe, but certainly not if you had a different cosmological constant. So yeah, I think I'd encourage people to actually look at what the competent advocates of kind of, if there's some argument that you don't like that you think is wrong, actually make a list in your mind of your objections to the argument, and then see what the advocates say about those objections. See what Robin Collins says about your objections to fine tuning. Don't just have sort of like a vague mishmash of several different objections hazily clumped together, where when one's dismissed, you sort of jump to a new one. No, like actually, to try to think carefully through, like, what are the specific objections? What would someone who rejects the view say about them? Otherwise, I think that's a recipe for a lot of bias and dogmatism. And one of the things that's frustrating about the new atheists and those of Dillahunty's ilk is they talk a big game about rationality and reason and science and logic. But I think they don't apply it consistently. They don't apply the standards for reason that they champion, that they tout, when it comes to philosophy of religion. They're instead very quick to be extremely dogmatic, to instinctively dismiss a view simply because it sounds silly, to instinctively just reject a view without carefully considering the objections, to fall prey to very extreme kinds of confirmation bias, where they sort of will kind of like half listen to a debate, basically like, while doing something else, just sort of listening for when they feel like their guy scores a point without really listening to the other side. And I think it's a shame. It's an important topic. It's a topic that's worth getting right, worth thinking clearly about. And I think it's unfortunate that many people don't do that. This isn't just true on the atheist side. It's also true, I think, on the theist side to a significant degree. Certainly, we can all fall prey to a whole host of biases and to certainly to confirmation bias. But I think we should all work to combat it to whatever degree we can.
Matthew, how long ago was it that you kind of realized that you think theism is true?
So I've been a theist for 2-ish years, or like year and a half. I think.
When that happened, what was it like a gradual thing, or did you look up from a book one day and go, "Oh my, I've been wrong this whole time"? Or was it like a single moment? How did that happen?
It was pretty gradual. So the thing, there's actually sort of an element of both of those things. So, for a while, my view had been that, well, I realized theists were, there are lots of smart and competent theists. My view had been that theism is really, really implausible. Like, there are some philosophical views where there are really smart people who defend them, but you just think the view is kind of crazy. Like, this is true of error theory, where people say every moral sentence is false. There are some really smart error theorists, but nonetheless, it's hard to take it seriously. The view just seems so ridiculous. So that was kind of my view about theism for shortly after I was born till, roughly the age of 18-ish. I guess when I was younger, I had less well thought out views. I just thought theism was ridiculous. Wasn't aware that people had arguments for it, or that the arguments, had any force. But at one point I was reading a book, and it didn't even argue for theism. It was arguing that Christians should be universalists. And for some reason, it just struck me for the first time, like, okay, I'm not on board, but like, maybe this could be right. I'm not convinced, but like, it's not totally crazy. And then after that, I sort of considered the arguments in more detail, and my credence steadily crept up the more I thought about the arguments and thought through objections, until eventually I became convinced that there was a God.
Wow. Well, listen, man, I sure have enjoyed having you here today, and I want to have you back if you're willing to come back. Maybe just talk about something else, and we could do some more shows together. But thanks so much for doing the debate and agreeing to do the debate. And I think it was really good. And like I say, I don't know anyone who's done better really against Dillahunty. While it was not a debate that Dillahunty did with a Christian, I think theism there came out clearly on top in this discussion. So I so appreciate what you did. And folks, check out the Bentham's Bulldog blog or Substack. Do we still call a Substack a blog? I don't even know the term.
Yeah, I think blog is
and
correct.
Also your video channel here on YouTube. That's linked in the description. And any last thoughts?
No, thanks so much for having me. This has been fun. Happy to chat.
All right. And with that, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.